Welcome to another edition of Base Camp Nation. We're excited about our guest that's going to be with us here tonight, Jansen, and he has a Marine story to tell that is dramatic, and we'll talk about some of the conflict that he experienced overseas and the transition of coming back to normal life, to civilian life, and what that looks like, which I think is very emblematic of our own spiritual journey, of all these different things that are colliding together, which in many ways we may be more acutely aware of with the current chaos that's going on in our culture right now. It has that sense of a nation almost at war. And there's just all these events that are transpiring that have this powder keg feel to it, this certain level of uncertainty, a lot of soul shrapnel that's coming to the surface, and just a lot of chaos and confusion. And so I think Ron's story will really speak to that, even though many of us can't relate to actually being a Marine in combat. I think there's some great parallels that we can take away from his story to help maybe perhaps interpret some of our own. So we're excited about you being here tonight. My name is Kevin DeVries. I'm the founder and president of Grace Explorations, and this is a live stream event that we created accidentally, actually as a result of the pandemic this past spring. And it's kind of taken off now where it's happening on a monthly basis, and we are just super excited about the thousands and thousands of people that we're reaching. Whereas before we could only reach men at base camp, now we can reach them and their families and their wives and their communities. So welcome wherever you are listening all around the world to Base Camp live stream. So to put these on, quite frankly, it does cost a little bit of money. It's very similar to our base camps that we have at breweries, which this fall are actually closed to groups. And so we'd like you to just kind of keep this in mind as you're listening. We can't really take up an offering like we do on a physical location, so it costs a couple $100, which is typical of what we usually take in on a cash offering at any one of our base camps. So if you could partner with us, we sure would appreciate that. You can sponsor the whole thing if you'd like, or you can just give monthly or just give a one-time gift. However you can simply go to Grace Explorations, that's plural with an S.com, click on the donate button, and make your donation there. If that's not where you are or you're not in that place, we certainly would also covet your prayers, and we're also very grateful for your participation here tonight. So whether you partner with us or whether you pray or participate, we're grateful for whatever level of engagement you can do. So rather than just talking about the fact that we've had 2,500 guys come to base camp and it's a growing movement, and we've actually launched a couple more of them this fall, mostly in barns for that matter, or under pavilions, and rather than just talk about the thousands that we're reaching with Base Camp live stream, we thought we would just isolate one particular story here tonight to talk about what Base Camp means to him personally. So let's just go ahead and play that video, and then we'll come back and introduce our guests here for this evening.
My first experience at Base Camp was actually the first Base Camp ever. And I thought, this has real potential. It really does. I mean, here's a bunch of guys that largely don't know each other in the group. You might have come with some friends, but you see the same faces coming to these again and again. You get to know people outside of your circle. You know, as a divorced man, I didn't have a whole lot of divorced friends. I go to base camp and I see guys that have, it's long past and they've already gone through all those trials, and they'll tell you how to handle it. For me, I found some people in base camp to be accountable to with situations that I was facing, and situations which if I kept to myself, I probably would have made wrong choices. And having men that you can just say, hey, look, this is what I'm dealing with right now. It's a problem, and I need you to keep me accountable on this. And knowing you're not going to hear about it from other sources then, knowing you've got that secure person, you can say, hey, look, this is what's going on. Just talking about it sometimes, to me, in that context, that just clears it up for me. It's like I'm no longer pondering this bad decision. I've already told somebody I don't want to make that bad decision, and it's gone. It's a non-option now. As you go on, as you continue in base camp, you find guys that they're just now coming through problems that you've already dealt with. And it's just been great to be able to be real with people and not have to be guarded. In every church setting I've ever seen, I think men are much more guarded, especially about their sin and problems and temptations they're facing. They just don't talk about it in the church. I don't know why churches are that way. They shouldn't be. The church should be a place where you could go and be able to say things that you're dealing with and not feel like you're going to be judged. And unfortunately, a lot of men aren't finding that in their churches. And they go to church, and sometimes it almost seems like it's something they're doing really for their wives or for their family, but they're not personally getting they're getting information, but they're not getting connection. Okay, men are getting information about the Word of God, and they know how to order their lives, but they don't have people they're walking along with beside them that are from their church. And the body of Christ is much broader than your local church, and men getting together to talk about Christ is a good thing no matter where you find it.
Well, welcome back. We have Ron Jansen back with us, and Ron is just a great friend, and he's actually shared at a couple of our base camps as well. And so people are like, why do you bring on all these guys that you've already had at your physical locations? And I'm like, well, that's the beauty of it, because I am a little bit familiar with the story, and they were well received amongst our tribe, if you will, at our brewery-based locations. But it also gives a chance for a guy to say, hey, grab his wife or his significant other, his family, his friends, and let's hear the story. But it also gives us an opportunity to take this story into perpetuity, so we can tape this thing. We like to think that base camp is kind of like Vegas, and so what happens at the brewery kind of stays there. So it's more of the R-rated version. We've had some guys that have just literally put a lot of information in front of us that even maybe made some grown men blush. And we don't want to do that with live stream. This is not quite focused on the family, but it is a little bit more family friendly, PG-13. So it gives us an opportunity to take Ron's story and just create a great atmosphere where we can kind of walk through this in an interview format, unlike base camp, which is more of a monologue, and then Q&A after that. I want to excerpt out of a book. Ron, if you could hold that book up there. It's called Fallujah Awakens, if I'm saying that correctly. Mm-hmm. And it's just a snapshot in time of your company in Fallujah, which was, we talked a little bit before we came on camera, it was one of the, certainly the most contested battle, or one of them during the whole engagement. And literally, it felt like when I read the book and pieces of it, it felt like, man, this is like Stalingrad or Leningrad all over again in World War II, where the two sides are just coming together. Both know that the stakes are pretty high, but it's just block by block, building by building. A lot of every day is filled with uncertainty, and it's very aggressive. I guess you could say it would be parallel to like the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, if military people that are watching have read about that as well. So it had this feeling like there was a lot at stake. The war is going to swing one way or another based on what happens there. And so you were right in the thick of that, a West Michigan guy, and here you are, almost literally parachuted into just a really aggressive combat situation, which most of us that are civilians can't relate to. So I just want to give a snapshot here and just read this first chapter just to set the stage. And again, it's Fallujah Awakens, Marines, Sheiks, and the Battle Against Al-Qaeda by Bill Ardolino. Thank you. All right, I'm wearing my old man glasses, so I'm going to do my best here to read. A mission to flush out and kill or capture insurgents in Hawa kicked off in the early morning hours of March 3rd, 2017. The largest operation of Alpha 124's deployment aimed for surprise. 3 of the company's 4 platoons would surround and sweep through the isolated village in a swift maneuver designed to cut off any chance of escape for their targets. Jansen's men had been down there here only once before their deployment, about a month or so earlier. His squad had been moving through the area with Weapon Platoon's 2nd Squad, where the other Marines had taken a huge amount of fire from insurgent machine gunners and snipers near the village. As Jansen's men, can I say it the Dutch way, or is it?
You got to say Jansen.
I got to say Jansen. All right, we'll do the American way. I'm sorry, It's the Dutch thing coming out of me. As Jansen's men laid in and around a palm grove, waiting for a fleeing target or the order to assault, an insurgent drove a white sedan straight into their lines while rushing to back up his compatriots. The Iraqi belatedly realized his error and backed up furiously before grabbing an AK-47, bailing out of the vehicle and shooting most of a magazine at the Marines. He never had a chance. He went down in a hail of bullets, and we'll actually have some pictures that kind of lend itself to that story. As they started to search the second house in the village, Lance Corporal Wortman spotted something. Inside, he saw 3 groggy men and something that looked like a stock of a rifle peeking out from below one of the Iraqi sleeping mats. Osborne clicked the switch on his radio and said, "Hey, Jansen, get over here now." Osborne quickly briefed him on the 3 men inside the small room. Jansen and Osborne immediately moved inside with their weapons raised. Wortman positioned himself in the doorway behind them. The Marines pointed their weapons at the men while Jansen screamed at them in Arabic to stand up and show him their hands. The two men on the left hesitated as they looked towards the third man, who remained squirming under his blanket. Alarm bells were clanging in Jansen's head. He yelled again. His instincts were screaming at him to shoot, but he didn't have the legal or moral authority to do so. Can't imagine being in that spot. It must have felt like time just kind of stood still. I mean, it's just, the clock is moving, but it must have had that surreal feel to it of you've got milliseconds to make a decision here that could result in your life or their life. Osborne's adrenaline surged as well. Every fiber in his body, if I can get the second page here, told him that something was wrong, but he couldn't disregard the possibility of a language or cultural gap. The two men on the left continued to steal glances at the third man as they slowly rose to comply with the Marines' instructions. Their expressions seemed resigned as they stood up and finally showed their hands. Jansen then continued screaming at the man, wrestling under the blanket. His instincts were now on fire. He was beginning to dismiss concerns about the legality of pulling the trigger. The third man finally sat up and then began to stand. And as he rose, the blanket fell from his body, and he seemed to drop something. He quickly dipped down to pick up a small object. Beams of white light flashed across a smooth metal grenade in the Iraqi's right hand. His left hand moved toward it. Jansen fired first. Osborne joined him a millisecond later. I mean, I'm just reading this and my adrenaline is just kind of firing up here. What is, it's easy for me to read this and be detached from it because it's another quote unquote war book. But what does that do when you hear those words? And I know I kind of butchered it with the cadence of everything, but man, when you hear these words and you can envision yourself right back, does your heart race pick up? What are you feeling right now as those words are being read?
Yeah, no, it's, excuse me. It's definitely an intense feeling that I have from that. I mean, I would say my heart rate is up. You feel the adrenaline. And as you were reading that, I can feel myself back in that, room. And that's the same with a lot of these stories. I mean, this one is obviously a little bit different because there was a reporter that pulled together a bunch of stories and put it in the book. Which gives us a view, really it gives me a third-person view of something I experience, which is a little bit different. But it's definitely an intense feeling and a bit strange, but helpful to go back to once in a while too. I don't want to ever walk away from those experiences completely and not have any concept that they happened or I guess just lose out on those experiences completely.
Was it, so we know the World War II vets were famous for not talking about anything. It was just kind of, I think, their honor code or just the way they processed the war. It was like, hey, it was a good war if there is such a thing. I mean, the enemy was at least engaging in normal terms. They were not hiding. It wasn't guerrilla tactics. There was a clear winner at the end of it. As much as the Germans and the Japanese had fought, they acquiesced to surrender, and then that was it. Mm-hmm. Right? And you were fighting a war of almost like a revolutionary type of scenario where it's just, this is guerrilla. And the basis of honor is not quite there, and you don't know exactly who the enemy is. And so it had that feeling, maybe in somewhat echoing Vietnam. I've worked with some of those vets on some of the expeditions that I've been on. And, when we were in those areas in the Middle East together on our adventures, if you will, which was probably like a Boy Scout expedition for them, they just felt like the tension was kind of like that. You just didn't know who was your friends by day and your enemies by night. So you're in this very complicated geopolitical situation that has all kinds of sub-narratives that are going on, clannish activity. You don't know who quite your enemy and your friend is. But was that a hard story to go back to? Like, was there a couple of years where you're just like, I don't want to talk about this?
I would say overall, my experience coming back from something like that and just jumping back into work and I started school and other things and family was that it wasn't that I intentionally stayed away from them, but they really didn't seem to have a place in my life. Yeah. I mean, you go from that chaos and then back to something like, home in suburbia, and in a way, there's really not a place for a lot of those stories. I mean, that's one of the things I like about Base Camp is we can tell these types of stories and have these conversations without or in the correct context, where it's not about glorifying what we did or what happened. It's really just about talking about this is a part of our world. This is a part of our experience, and recognizing that without completely shying away from it.
Would you? So your faith, I'm sure, has a big part of that, because you're able to just see the larger Christian worldview, if you will. So you can fit these smaller stories in the big story, the epic story, the story of Christ and what he did for us on the cross, and how that just shapes all that you believe. And so, you and I would be on the same page with that, but I can imagine a guy that doesn't have that big meta narrative, that bigger story, walking into some of these smaller stories. These smaller stories can just, not that this was a small story, because it is a big story, but it's not the biggest story. I mean, it could just swallow you, where you just lose all sense of context, and your compass just kind of gets skewed. And you probably have friends that have come out of a similar experience that you've had that probably feel a little bit, lost right now, I would imagine. And then some of them that are doing remarkably well.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I would say it's, so I'm going to bring up Lord of the Rings here. I thought you would like that. I know we've got
second only to the Bible.
Right. I know we've got some Lord of the Rings nerds that are big fans of Base Camp. So I've just recently started, it was part of my quarantine book list. I read The Hobbit, and now I'm working through some of the other ones.
Okay.
But I think I would kind of relate it to Bilbo Baggins at the end of The Hobbit. When he comes back, he's been on this epic adventure where he's, through a lot of stuff. He's gone and fought the dragon and did a lot of things, found out a lot about himself. And he comes back, and there's not really much about it at the end of the book, but basically he comes back and he finds out that his relatives are auctioning off his possessions, and
he's dead.
Right. They've moved on, basically. And I think that's part of what it is for a lot of us is we, in a way the world has moved on, in a way we have moved on, those of us who experienced that, and trying to connect that back in. And so that's where I would tie faith back in, is that for me, that's been a constant. Now my faith has evolved over time, just because I've had to look at, the faith of someone who hasn't experienced combat or war is different than somebody who has. It's just, not that we don't believe in the same things, but you have to reconcile what you've seen in the evil in this world versus your experiences, and that sometimes is. It's still something I'm working through. And something I've talked to a lot of people about, because it can be challenging, and that goes far outside of combat or wartime experiences. I think for people who experience a lot of the evil in this world, connecting that back in with their faith is a critical part of that.
Right. That evil does exist, and it has a main part to play in this grand scheme of things that we call life, and people have a hard time labeling that. And so they think that therapy is we can just counsel people out of this evilness, or go the opposite end and just fight violence with violence. But, since the beginning of time, really, evil has been a part of our story. There's always been a villain. Every good story, every good book, everything that's worth reading or watching always has the hero, the villain, and then maybe a bunch of people that are kind of in between, and then you have the guide, and all these different dynamics in the story. And so it's really helpful for, I think, men to realize that when you juxtapose our life against the bigger story, evil has a part to play in that story. And I find that most men, quite frankly, are surprised or are underestimating the presence of evil. And part of my story, which is I'm not here to tell that, but with Steve's story, this evil, it's right in front of you. You have people that don't wish you well. And I'm being very understated by saying that. They want to exit you off the planet. And so you're left with the tension of this story that we just read, which is one of many stories that are in there, where evil is now staring you in the face. It has a name. It has an agenda. It's incredibly harmful. But I think us as civilians, speaking for most of us that are viewing, we've never had that type of punctuated period of time in our life where evil and good had a stark contrast, and life and death were happening. And we'll draw some military parallels to civilian life that guys like you will understand much more than those that happen. But I think it would help a man or his family, whoever's viewing right now, to understand that you are at war, whether you wish it or no. The enemy's army is marching on you. It's back to the whole Isengard thing. There is a strong negative force that is alive and well in this universe. And if you cannot get your mind wrapped around that there is an ancient evil, there is a name for it, Satan, devil, whichever name you want to, Lucifer, and he has been with us since the beginning of time and even prior to that. And he does not wish you well, and he will do everything he can to combat against your soul, similar to what you would see on a battlescape. And it's his job, if he can't kill you, which I think, quite frankly, is not as advantageous to him. He'd love to wound you, because wounded people wound other people, right? Healed people heal other people. And so I'm just really encouraged that you came through a really hard spot in your life, and then even after, having served, but your faith is intact. You have the bigger story that you can still fall back on. But you probably saw both extremes. You probably saw guys find faith, if you will, or faith finding them in the trenches. And then you probably maybe saw some people that just kind of lost it. You're like, I can't reconcile this kind of evil with how can God be good and yet there be so much evil, and seemingly evil is winning all the time. Like, what would you say to something like that?
Well, could you show the first picture there?
Yeah, let's put that first slide
picture
up here to give some context.
Yeah, so I think this is a picture of my squad. Mostly the men in my squad, and then we had a few Iraqi soldiers that were attached to us in this picture. But to go back to your question, I think everybody, you look at whatever experience you have in life, you look at it through the lens of your past experiences and beliefs and things like that. So sometimes those, combat or traumatic experiences, whatever they are, can solidify those beliefs, or sometimes they can just blow them out of existence, because they just go against whatever that was. So I would agree. I mean, everybody, and truthfully, I mean, I don't want to make it sound like my faith was never shaken by these sorts of things, or that my faith wasn't tested at times, because it definitely was then and has been since. But I think one of the things that, just looking at a picture like this, that everybody processes those things differently. And that's one of the things that I think is important as we talk about, veterans from either combat or whatever situation. It's hard to use one person's story and just apply that across the board to everyone else. And that's one of the things that has been a struggle for me, because I'll see how someone else has handled something or didn't handle something, and then try to relate that to my story. And it's been, it takes some processing to do that. So I think that's, but even, some of the guys that are in this picture, we're still going through that together today. I mean, some guys are further along in their faith. Some people have not, or have struggled there. And some people, it's not even a part of the conversation. But I think what is important is that the conversation is ongoing, and it's not something that you just either leave out of it, because like you said, there are, whether we want to admit it or not, our spirituality is an important part of who we are as humans, and it's something that we need to address in the context of the larger things going on in the world.
Yeah, for sure. You can't dissect those. Those are two interchangeable ones. So explain a little bit what's happening here. This is obviously your squad. Mm-hmm. And what I love about this picture, we talked about this a little bit beforehand, I love this because it's emblematic of what we're trying to do with Grace Explorations, and taking some of the military metaphors, particularly units, and describing how men interact with each other. So, I mean, if you go back to Israeli times, there's a couple millennia worth of information here, but the Army, if I can just speak in a general term, I know it doesn't apply necessarily to Marines. Well, let's use it for Marines. We'll get rid of the Army guys just for this window. Let's just say with the Marines, I mean, they understand how men interact in different units. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what we do at base camp is a company size, 75, 150 guys, either in 1 or 2 sessions at a brewery. And there's some beautiful things that can happen with that that can't necessarily happen in a smaller unit. And you'll find that a lot of stories that are being written are about a certain company. Obviously, the most famous would be, Bravo Company and some of the series that came off of that. But there's some things that'll happen in this smaller unit that can't happen in the larger units. One of which is very obvious, or it should be obvious, is that these guys will live and die for each other because they care about each other. and they care about each other because they know each other. And so this story, this picture in particular, is a great example of why we keep telling guys, get into a small group, get into a small group, get into that squad, or better yet, the fire team, the 4-person squad or the 4-person team, which is a couple of these are actually in this squad. Platoons are great, 15 to 30 or whatever, but really life change happens in that 8 to 10, or even preferably more specifically 4 to 5 guys. You won't care about the guy next to you, how he's doing spiritually or how he's doing with life, if you don't know that guy. And you're not going to know that guy unless you're starting to do life with that guy. So there's nothing wrong with Bible study curriculum. There's nothing wrong with all the wealth of information that's out there. But if that's all you're doing is gathering to gather information and expecting transformation and expecting community to build, camaraderie, or the core, if you will, it's just not going to happen. You have to start doing life together. And these guys were put in a position where literally your lives are dependent upon each other. Mm-hmm. You're in a firefight. The guy goes down next to you. Now your probability of going down, getting killed, MIA, KIA, whatever, is dramatically increased. So you're thinking about the fact that we need to stay alive. Like, we need to do this together. And we don't, as civilians, we can't contextualize that because first, we're not living in the big story. We don't think there's an enemy. We don't think that we can play the part of the hero. That's a little nuanced. Maybe that's not the correct word for it, but we don't realize we're on a journey, and we don't understand that community is absolutely core to what we do. And if you have secrets, and if you're living isolated, I think this whole cultural chaos that's going now on is basically like a wolf. And it's just running the herd, and it's just scattering people, and it's picking off marriages, it's picking off companies, it's picking off individuals that were maybe a little weak to begin with, and now they've got them on the run, right? You've got this cultural chaos. There's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of delusion and just distractions, and it's easy to get picked off. But I love this idea about the band of a brotherhood, of this idea of fighting for each other. Can you speak to that a little bit? Like, were these some of the closest connections that you've had in your life? And I know you've had various stages to your life of school and college and then work and family, church, but how did this feel different than anything you've experienced to date in your life?
So I think two things. One of the things you've said a lot at base camp that I really think resonates with this is that we either journey together or die alone.
Yeah.
And I think you're using a mountain climbing metaphor, but I can relate it very closely to this, where there is no, unless you watch Rambo or some of them, superhero or action movies from the 80s, there's no time.
But they're all based on true stories.
Well, right. There's no time in the military where you will ever do anything alone, where you're not, where you are on your own.
Sandless climbing. Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's what's important here is that, the thing is, you come back from an experience like this and you quickly are alone because you're not, you're not with the same people. And it over time, I think those of us who are in this picture who know each other, we've been more deliberate about getting together and connecting with each other because for so long it was so effortless. And truthfully, we wanted to be further apart. We were all crammed into one little room and we were sick of sleeping in the same room as each other.
It's almost like having little kids. They tire you out and you don't realize how beautiful and blessed you are at the time. Yeah. And then all of a sudden it's empty nest. And you're like, oh, shoot.
Yeah, you want nothing more than to be on your own. But that can be very isolating. And I think for, whatever stage you're at in life, it's really important to have people. And those things or those people might change over time. It may not be the same person from the day you're, 10 years old till you retire. But it's really important to have those types of people in your life who have those shared common experiences and beliefs. And so that connection with those guys, it's funny. We'll get together, at least half of us, once a year or so. And
were you all from West Michigan or?
For the most part, that was part of the story is that we're reservists. So we are basically based geographically. Now we had a few guys that were, attachments that were, from Tennessee or other places. But for the most part, most guys are still in the general area.
Yeah.
So we can get together sometimes, and it's great. But it's amazing how quickly we're back in the same dynamics, good and bad, to be honest. But because
almost like a
of
high
that
school reunion.
Oh yeah, yep. Yeah. Because of that shared experience that we're there, and that has started to evolve over time, which has been really good. Where we can be a little bit more real with each other and dig into some of the deeper stuff without just a lot of it is just joking and laughing about stuff that happened and things like that. But we're able to just be real with each other too, which is really important.
They must have had some core principles, that you just kind of stuck with and lived by. But a lot of it seemed to be organic. It wasn't like you're just going to recite this stuff. You just were doing it.
Right. No, because go back to like the core values of the Marine Corps: honor, courage, and commitment. Those are very important things. I think anybody in life should strive for those. However, those are ideals. They're not really something that you put in. Well, you can live your life much differently than those, even being a part of the the Marine Corps or some other organization like that. So I think that's one of the important important pieces is there's what you set out to do, and then there's what you actually end up doing, and sometimes those are very different, and that's part of that's part of a lot of people's experience too, that you join for very patriotic or altruistic reasons with outside of yourself. There are better paying jobs than joining the military as a private or whatever. But then sometimes those collide with the reality of the world and what that is. And I think that can relate to a lot of things in life. It's not just the military. And so where that plays out in groups like this is really important to be able to process that and for a sense, or I think just understand it and understand that even if it didn't work out exactly how you wanted, there's still grace for that, and there's a lot more out there that we're called to and can pursue that as well.
So would you say it's true for you? You read a lot of these stories, and after talking to a lot of Marines and soldiers, you get this idea that, especially during a firefight or when there's actual combat, when the bullets are flying and there's just chaos that's settling in, these ideals are important, right? The mantras that we have and the mottos that we live by, but really in the heat of the moment, you're fighting to obviously stay alive, but you're fighting for the guys that are surrounding you. Mm-hmm. That's every story I've ever read, every guy I've ever interviewed, it comes down to when the lightning strikes and the thunder rolls and the bullets start flying, you're fighting for the guy next to you. And I think that's the unfortunate thing that I'm seeing a lot in culture at large with just everybody. It seems like every person's out for themselves. Like there's no cohesiveness anymore. There's nothing that unifies. Everything is divisive. It's amazing how much energy we put into just simple words now. We've weaponized everything, right? And it would be great to have just something that is so large. And I think that's where the Christian faith can help us to rally. They just had a very large rally that took place in Washington, D.C. It'll be a little bit after this particular episode, but it was this idea that, there's a bigger story that's going on here, and we have to keep our eyes on that bigger story. The big story is the gospel. That's the biggest story, and every other story has got to fit into that, and every other story needs to partner with that story. Otherwise, it just becomes another rabbit trail. Was there any disillusionment on your part? I know that, and we worked when I was on my adventures around the world, we had security details with us, but there was a couple of Vietnam vets that were with us, and they're always, the conversations were tinged with a lot of disillusionment of the cause itself was noble, right? You're doing what your country is asking you to do. In the case of Vietnam, it was to stop communism from spreading, which, on its face value is a good thing. Do you have any disillusionment or just a sense of, maybe the objective, like you alluded to it, this idea of what you think you're going to be sent for, and then maybe what is actually happening, which applies itself to all of life, right? We have this mental moving image of what we think we're on, going back to Bilbo's example. He just thinks he's going on a grand adventure, has little clue that, my gosh, you're going to be going into the bowels of a mountain, and you are going to face a living, breathing dragon that is frozen an entire generation of people that can't get their mind wrapped around going back to this mountain and getting back their space, getting back their mountain, their heritage. Do you feel any of that sense as a returning Marine of disillusionment of like, man, what did we really go there for, and what did it really mean, and what was it really worth?
Yeah. Well, first, you brought up Vietnam veterans, and I think it's important to just state, first of all, like, I can't imagine the experience they went through coming back from the war when they were
horrible.
And I think this country has come a long way since then. And we were welcomed back with like 8,000 people in the Deltaplex in Grand Rapids.
Wow. When your unit came back.
Yeah. Yep. And that was a very different experience. So, and if you think about it, Vietnam veterans, most of them were drafted. They just, all they did was not break the law by skipping out on the draft. And so to come back to open hostility and things like that, I can't imagine what that would be like, and I feel for them, because that's been a very different experience for us.
Because you guys were, you were reservists for the most part, right?
Right,
They activated reserve units, national. I mean, it was people that were already in the system, that were already in the military.
Yeah. I mean, almost everybody that I was with joined during a time of war, joined after 9/11.
Yeah.
So we all knew what our intentions were, but that wasn't the case for a lot of people. But going back to your question, I think there's definitely been some soul searching. I mean, it happens when when people in union are killed. I mean, you really wonder, what are we here for? If you think about the reasons you might join the Marine Corps or the military in general, but especially the infantry, it's typically not to provide safety and security operations for tribes in some other country that that may be on your side, maybe not be.
Could change from day to day.
Right, and it did at times. However, it's something you have to wrestle with, and I think that's where a lot of guys men or women or anyone could struggle with that sort of thing, because you really have to. It's not a clear-cut answer. I remember the first day we arrived at Camp Fallujah, before we went to our area of operations. There was a Colonel, I think it was Joe Nichols, and he's kind of a legend in the Marine Corps for getting wounded and coming back like 6 weeks later to the same job. And anyway, he was the commander of the area at the time, and he told us, like, if you're looking for black and white answers here, good guys, bad guys, you're in the wrong place. We don't have that. We've got people that sort of support us and can help us. We've got people that hate us and also don't fight against the other people that are sort of supporting us. We've got to figure out, it is what it is. We need to figure out a way to make it a difference here. And so
this is one of your first talks when you're coming in.
Right. This was like the day before we went to our forward operating base.
Wow.
So
that had to be a little unsettling, because you probably kind of knew some of that, but this is a little more nuanced than what you gave it to be.
Sure. Yep. It was, but also it was the reality of this, what was going on there. And I think that was important, just confronting the brutal truth and not trying to sugarcoat it, or simplify something that can't be simplified. So all that being said, I think it's it's still a challenge to date sometimes, because you see, even since we've left, we saw a lot of improvement while we were there working with the local tribes, and they really stood up and helped to support kicking out the insurgents. But since then, ISIS came over, years later, ISIS came back in. They were driven back out by the Iraqi forces, some American support. And now it's, in a way, you hope that you gave some support to people who were trying to really live out their own destiny. I think that's what it was. And I don't know that I would change much, to be honest, even though that's something I've had to wrestle with as well.
How do you see this part of your story? Like, I think that's where a lot of people struggle with stories that don't seem to fit into the narrative thread of their life. Like, we all have episodes that we're like, man, if I wrote my story, like my life as a book, I would not have written that chapter because it seems incongruent or disconnected from the rest. Mm-hmm. Have you reached a point in your journey now where you can see in some ways like this had to happen? Not that it was an awful thing, but there were some difficult things here to bring you to the place where you are now. Because quite frankly, this interview probably wouldn't even be happening if it wasn't for some of those things. And then the subsequent stuff that you had to journey through coming home and transitioning into what that looked like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could you go to the next picture there? So this picture I've got included just because it kind of gives a snapshot of where I was at the time, in the middle of it, in the thick of it. Like you could see this.
And this actually fits into the story that I just read.
This was the first example that was in what you read, where the surgeon drove up on us in a palm grove, jumped out and was shooting an AK-47. We all shot him. But it just kind of, for me, it like signifies the crazy stuff that was going on at the time. And it doesn't fit anywhere within my story in a lot of ways, other than the fact that it's an experience that I can relate to. I guess I'm more able to relate to crazy things that happen to other people, whether combat or war or anything else. I can kind of see myself in that story or in that situation, just because I've been through something like this. So I remember It was years after we were back, and my marriage was falling apart. Things were not good. I was just really struggling, and just really asking God, like, why on earth did this? Why would you send me to this place to experience these things? You know, everything has gone poorly in Iraq since then. Like, what was all this for? And I truly don't know the answer. I think I have more confidence now that there is something in that experience that, you know, brings out something in me and also allows me to connect to others and relate to others in ways that I wouldn't have in the past.
Wow, that's huge. So it gave you a very precious gift, which is empathy. Right?
Sure, which
You're able
and
to
it's
connect.
taken a long time to unpack that empathy, because I think one of the things that helps you succeed in a situation like
You
this,
can't have empathy.
You
just
have absolutely zero. Like, I remember
become like a
situations
rock.
where I, in my brain, it registered, this is sad, or I really should feel bad about this,
Yeah.
but I didn't. Like, that part of me was dormant at the time, and I think that's what a lot of us struggle with. Did you feel like that just went away? Like, you know, a part of you died that was good, you know, in a tough situation, and will you ever get that back? And I think that's one of the things that, you know, through the healing process, is you could see that those things start to come back, and I mean, that's what really gives me hope.
Would you say this is true? Again, I've read this over and over again, and it's something it seems like it's in every war movie as well, but it's this idea that every man dies in battle. It's just that some come home. There's something that happens with the human condition that even though the cause may be noble, right, where you're literally defending your own life, it's either theirs or yours, or they have taken the fight to you, or you had all the moral and legal authority to do what you needed to do as a counter action to whatever had been done previously. But would you say that part of that's true in the sense that it's a sacred thing to take somebody's life? Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of first responders that we work with, you know, that's heavy, you know, because that person has now gone into another dimension, and you were part of that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Almost as sacred as a doctor, you know, bringing in a baby into a world. There's something sacred about these rites of passage, and you know, it's a heavy weight, even though the situation may be noble, or as we know, you know, during firefights, especially in the fog of war, there's a lot of innocent life that's taken. That's just, I guess in a callous way, we could say that that's collateral damage. But do you feel like a part of you may just be still on that battlefield, you know, that you're I wouldn't say trying to get back, because Christ does make all things whole, but man, there must have been some kind of shattering of some level of innocence there. Because this is not a typical West Michigan upbringing, right?
Right.
You know, you go to church, you work on the farm, or you do this or you do that, and it's pretty static. You know, it's not super dynamic. There's a trajectory of your life. This is in a foreign country. You're placed in situations that are almost surreal. It's like, is this a movie or is this real life? Because this script has gone crazy. Do you feel like there's something that was lost, you know, in that regard?
Well, like I said, I think there are parts, in order to really function in an environment like that, there are parts of you that have to go dormant or just can't be addressed at the time. Like I said, that empathy and a lot of the emotions of it. And that's a big part of military training, is just kind of compartmentalizing maybe those sorts of things. I think it's really getting back to those that is the difficult part, or opening those boxes back up eventually. Right. And truthfully, I had no experience even doing that even before going into the military. I avoided any sort of feeling or emotion as much as I could, and just pushed on without it. So I don't know if I would say that, you know, some people don't come back, other than those who are, you know, truly killed. However, I would say everybody, or most, probably struggle with that. What does it mean to then, you know, operate in a completely different situation, right, in a, you know, civilian environment where the rules are different, the level of intensity is different. In some ways, like, being in combat simplifies life. You know, they're trying to kill us, we're trying to kill them, let's work it out. And that it's not always that simple in other situations, where you do bring in feelings and emotions and all these other things that you want to be respectful of, but it doesn't always line up that way.
When I was in high school, we were required to read All Quiet on the Western Front, which is perhaps arguably one of the greatest war books ever written. And it was a true account. The Nazis hated it because it was written by a German soldier in the trenches of World War I. And it was a brilliant writer. And I can't say his name, and if I could, I'd butcher it. But he had just such power with words. But he talked about how at the first shriek of the shell, and there was a lot of bombardment. I mean, it was a very static war. You're just fighting over mud. I mean, it was not like this at all where you're moving and you're going, there was just fighting in these trenches. And he said at that first shriek of the shell, just whistling overhead, alluding to the same thing that you were saying, he said they had to become like animals. That animal instinct had to take over. Their humanity had to take a backseat because it's the only way that they could survive. And he felt like it was actually, it was protective, and it was the way that they actually conversely and paradoxically stayed human. By becoming an animal, they stayed human because that's how you have to function in that world. And he talked about this idea of the soul of the soldier at that time going into what he would call like a winter slumber. Like it was winter settled in, everything went, you used the word dormant, and you just have this numbing effect where you have to do what you have to do, and part of that is becoming an animal. You crawl on the ground, you hovel in the trench when the bombardment's going on, and then you pop up out of the parapet and you just charge forward, and hopefully you're not going to get mowed down. But and then the tension of that. So then he talked about, as that book further developed, and it's just a masterpiece, but he talked about going to visit his mom. And here he is, the front was not that far, right? I mean, it's mostly fought in France and Belgium at that point. So he could be home, he could hop on a train and be home by the end of the day. I mean, it was crazy. A British soldier could be fighting in the front lines, jump over the channel, and be in a theater that night. I mean, nobody knew warfare like that before. And so he came back home, and then he would talk to the village elders, and they would pontificate over what they would do, and how's it going in the trenches there, and something with a false sense of bravado. And he was just like, you guys have no clue the madness that we are holding at bay, just the rage of an entire generation of soldiers that is just wasting away for ideologies that they don't really, quite frankly, care about. They're just trying to come home. And then he talked about a little bit of that tension that you hear from soldiers as well, of this idea that part of him actually enjoyed being in the front because it was clear, and he was fighting for something that he did, somewhat believe in, but it was more than that. It was transcendent, that he wanted to experience that brotherhood. And it's just a very poignant, powerful story that develops over several chapters, but it just stuck with me, this idea that during times of war, during times of trauma, that the soul itself actually goes into a winter slumber. It actually falls asleep. It becomes numb. And maybe that's a challenge of reentry, and it has a lot of parallels to because we deal with a lot of, I know there's a nuance between PTS and PTSD, and I know as it relates to military life, that has to be more acutely handled, especially for those that are actively serving. For civilians, maybe not so much, but it's this idea that how do you wake up this sleeping dragon? How do you wake up this soul that is in sleep because it had to be to survive and to do what it had to do and see what it had to see? And a lot of first responders that we're now journeying with, quite frankly, feel to me like soldiers. In your case, a Marine, where it's just, it feels like war. You just don't know what's going to happen, and everything's triggering, and there feels like there's a lot of angst out there on both sides of that coin. But what helped you to kind of get to that place where your soul was able to enter spring again, where you were able to come back alive?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't remember that part of the book. I guess I didn't. I had to read it in high school also, and I guess I just
it was long.
I glossed
actually
over
reread
that
it like
one.
2 years ago.
I might have to check
There's
it out.
language in there as an adult.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable, the grasp of the human language that he had. But he just brought, it was all poetic, and you just felt this sense of spatiality, of distance.
Yeah. Well, actually, could you go to this can be the last picture, the next one here. So this picture, one that I included, it was just, it kind of represents for me. So this was in the same village where, the excerpt from the book was. And it really represents for me kind of what the coming out of the chaos and coming home. And I like that metaphor of kind of the winter in your soul when things just have to be dormant. You can't
It overwhelmed you.
Right. You couldn't function in a situation like that if you were allowed to feel all the feelings that you should be at the time. But I think part of the the message that we get, or that just kind of is ingrained in people, is that, okay, there's enough war movies where the veteran comes home and isn't the same, and he's cracked up, and he just doesn't, never is the same person. And
Right.
that was something I always hated when, if I ever heard, like, just not the same. And first of all, no kidding. Neither is your son who went away to college for 4 years. Like,
Right.
he's not the same person as when
Yeah.
he started. Like, but I think there's also that, there's not always a clear path to start to experience those things and for it to be okay. So for me, part of it, I think, was having children, because that was just a totally different situation. And
Did
seeing
you have any
them
kids
start
when you
to,
were over there?
No, I didn't. Nope.
Okay.
Not until a year and a half or so after we got back. But that was part of the process for me, is to start to see how they process things. And first of all, realizing that I had some work to do in order to be able to relate to them and understand. And quite honestly, I mentioned earlier, but it was really a point where, because I wasn't really, I guess, unthawing, or whatever metaphor you want to use, that wasn't the only reason, but things between my wife and I really fell apart dramatically and drastically, and it was ugly and brutal. And in going through that, I mean, really impacted every part of who I was, but it forced me to start to see that there were things that it was by no choice of my own, but I couldn't push all this stuff aside anymore. I couldn't, I couldn't.
It was front and center.
hide it. I couldn't, and really forced me to confront it in a way that I hadn't before, or even thought I could, was to come through something like that. So that was part of it too, and that I wouldn't recommend that route for anybody, but that's part of it. For me, it was, finding the humility that I didn't have it all figured out, that I wasn't untouched by this, or that I wasn't somebody who could just go through everything and not be bothered by it. Because that was the front I wanted to portray to people. But eventually that all collapsed, and I really just had to confront that, these feelings that I'm feeling are real. I've got to deal with them. There's a reason why they're there, and start to work through that sort of thing.
Yeah. One thing that I've admired about you and your journey is, I know we both know Matt Kenny, and Matt is one of our soul surgeons, and just shared at one of our base camps at the barn here just a little bit ago. And you've been really wise to find those guys out and to track with them. I know you've been in a couple of retreats with him, and I think I just commend you for that, because that takes humility. Pride says, I'm the cowboy, I'm the Lone Ranger, I don't need anybody's help, I'm a self-contained, self-governing unit, thank you very much, and then just do your thing. And I think the cowboy mythos is alive and well still, where it's the man with no name. He just kind of wanders into the story and cleans up all the bad guys, but you never get to know this guy, and then he goes off into isolation again, and he lives this singular, insulated life. And I just want to commend you for opening up your life. And I know that part of that was just the pain threshold was such that you had to get help.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can commend me all you want, but I really was at a point where I met Matt as a counselor. I mean, I went to him as a counselor, not knowing him before, on a recommendation.
But you still had a choice.
Else,
you could have ended the story.
Yeah. Yep.
A lot of people will just choose that. Just stop the story, end the pain, and we all know what that looks like.
Yeah. Yep. Or just continue living as if it wasn't an issue. I mean, that was, but
numb, medicate, whatever you need to do.
I think for me, maybe getting glimpses of what life could be with parts of me being unthawed, gave me so much hope that there's something better out here. I don't need to live in this place where I control everything and try to control the narrative. There's a bigger story, like you said, and finding that out and finding wise people who can point you in the right direction there makes all the difference with that sort of thing.
Would you agree that control is basically, it's an illusion?
Yes. I think control in the short term is possible. Long term, it will fall away.
Which probably felt a lot looking back now in retrospect of just this idea that we can control the situation, and you realize, man, there's just a lot of factors I didn't even know about.
Right.
That
And
preceded
I think,
you by thousands of years and will live on for thousands of years.
And I think that is one of the things that I've seen, looking at what we're going through right now with the pandemic, just the other things that are going on politically and everything. Control has so much to do with it, that I see people
Absolutely.
trying to control what it is, not being controlled, or doing certain things, and it's on all ends of the political spectrum. I think most of the things that people are arguing about are about control. It's not about an actual response or the right thing to do in most situations.
Yeah. Well, it's human nature, right? When things are out of control, we go to control mechanisms. We have one more slide here. Did you want to put that up?
Sure.
Maybe you can talk about that, and then we'll close here.
Yeah, yep. So this is a mirror or another image of that first slide we shared. And so this was just something that we did a couple of years ago to kind of immortalize that first picture. So it was a guy named Chris Laporte, who was an artist that did this for us. And I think it was great, first of all, because he captured the same image. We were able to add one of the guys in my squad in who wasn't in the picture because he had been sent home earlier in the deployment. His wife was in a really bad car accident, so he had to head home. So it was great to have that, and really just for me, it was a way to bring, like I said, I had pushed those wartime experiences out and just moved on, or thought I had moved on for many years. But for me, this was an opportunity to kind of bring that back in. I mean, it's hanging in my living room right now just because it is a part of me. It's, and I think that's important for all of us that have these sorts of experiences, whatever they are a part of you, whether you wanted them or not, they are. And just really owning that and being able to own that part of your story is really important.
Well, one last thing, and you're typically Dutch. We don't handle compliments real well, so just take this. This will require humility on your part, but I really love seeing your journey. I mean, this is a warrior, and this is his fellow warrior tribe members. And what God seems to be doing in your life, which is also emblematic, I think, of the age that you're moving into, is taking that warrior who is kind of a singular combatant, right? It's mostly about him. It's checking the boxes. A lot of guys in their 20s and 30s are consumed with building their resume, checking the boxes, climbing the ladder, whatever it is, moving up the military rank. And then you kind of get in your mid-40s, you hit a little bit of a crisis point, and then you get more into your 40s and then 50s, and you develop this idea of what does it look like to become a king, which is generative, which you've done now with your family. You have children, you have a legacy, your marriage is intact. And so the kingdom that God has given Ron is solid right now. Is it perfect? No. Did the whole story play out the way you wanted it to that led to your ultimate redemption? No. But in a way, I think there's enough humility with you and your story where you're like, yeah, maybe our marriage wouldn't be as strong as it was right now if it wasn't for some of those things that hit. Or I wouldn't be the person that I am today if I hadn't gone through these experiences that were not just emblematic, but were literally in warrior mode. So I just want to commend you with that. I think that's God's ultimate objective, is to take guys and not temper that warrior spirit, but make their story bigger than just them. Like you said, part of your healing, it came through that generative process of having children. Mm-hmm. That's what a king does. He creates people, he leads people, and it's less about him or fighting these certain battles. And your kids, divinely, that you mean to have them as a blessing for you, right? You want someone to take care of you when you're older. We don't necessarily think about that, but those are some things that's legacy. Who's going to carry on the name? Who's going to, carry on this bloodline? They now have been part of your healing process, of giving you a larger purpose to live. And so I want to commend you, and those that are viewing, is to view yourself in that royal metaphor, that really what you're about is about leading others and about building kingdoms where you can, whether it's with your family, whether it's with your marriage, your ministry, and never forgetting that nobility. I love that part of the Braveheart movie where there's a certain dialogue, and I'm going to butcher it, but it's essentially this idea that the Braveheart character, played by Mel Gibson, was essentially saying two things at once that seem to be directly opposing each other, but they can live in tension because they're both true. He was basically saying, yes, I am noble, and I'm also savage, because he could speak Latin, which is a noble language, but he's also savage. He's a Highlander, and they're fighting guerrilla tactics. And I love that about a man of God, that he can be both. David, he had a warrior part of him, man. I mean, he could cut off heads. There was a savage part of him that could do what was needed to be done in the moment, but there was also something very noble about him, where when he made his biggest mistakes, that's the beauty of David's story, is he could humble himself and say, God, I don't have control of this situation, and could humble himself and never lost the ability, unlike almost every other king of Israel or Judah who gave into some form of idolatry. David's heart always seemed to be after God. And I think that's part of your story, is you've always recognized the big story, and you've always kept your eye on the target. So I'm excited to see where your story goes. I think it's fantastic, that your family's together, your marriage is stronger than it's probably ever been. There's some really good chapters ahead in your life, and I'm grateful that we could step into this chapter here together tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
You bet. So for those of you that are viewing, we appreciate you spending some time with us. This is a great story. Can you hold that book up again? If this is of interest to you, it's a great book, Fallujah Awakens, and it's essentially the chronicle of your unit's deployment and this particular scene that we read in this particular chapter to kind of give some context to what we were doing. But if you are struggling with trauma in all of its variations, we would just encourage you. There's a great story by C.S. Lewis called The Chronicles of Narnia, and he also was a World War I vet. And he created this mythological world called Narnia, and he did it so beautifully well. I think it was actually cathartic. He was probably channeling something he wasn't even aware of. He was an orphan, or virtually one, was estranged from his dad, lost his mother at an early age, was in a battalion in World War I that saw heavy decimation. There was a guy that basically a bombardment, and the guy next to him turned into a red mist. There was nothing left, and he got some shrapnel, went home, and then subsequently, years later, began writing this story. But he had this whole character development where there was a witch, and everything she touched in this mythological world of Narnia would be frozen. And I don't know if he intended for this, or if it was intuitive, or if it was something that was not even he was aware of, but I look at that as trauma. And so this witch character would come into these scenes throughout the book, specifically The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and everything she touched was frozen. And the season of Narnia was stuck in winter. It was in slumber, and there wasn't any movement. But then this other character named Aslan came into the scene, and wherever Aslan appeared, spring came. And all of a sudden, this thawing came into view, and spring would come, and the birds would start chirping again, and the flowers would bloom, and the trees would bud, and things would become green again. And so I kind of like to say it this way, and then I'm done, is this idea that it's always winter, never spring, until you hear the words of the King. And I think that is emblematic of the words of Christ, that Jesus has to call out to you from your own grave, from your own tomb, through that stone that you think is the end, because it feels like a tomb, or it doesn't feel like anything at all because you're dead and you're numb and your soul is in a winter slumber. It's just to ask God to speak to you in a way that you can understand, that you can hear through the stone of your own heart, of your own situation, and you can hear Christ the King calling you back from the dead. And maybe that's what this whole story is about tonight. You could have easily perished on the battlefield. You know guys that went that didn't come home. And we want people to come home. We want men to come home. We want marriages to come home. We want ministries to come home. We want nations to come home. Everybody on a deep subterranean level is yearning for resurrection. It's probably why the last of the Marvel series did so well, because it brought back this collective sense that there is a return. There is this massive cosmic resurrection of all the pieces coming back together. But we want that for everyone. And so to do that, you have to do it in community. We're one tribe amongst many, but we would be honored if you could partner with us. Again, you can give at graceexplorations.com, or you can pray anywhere, anytime, or you can participate. Come to one of our base camps that's on our website at graceexplorations.com, or join us here live stream as you're doing here tonight. So God bless, and soldier on.